Reading is a big part of our daily life. We read all the time. We read not only to survive, but also for enjoyment. Imagine your perfect reading spot. Are you sitting or standing while you read? Are you cuddled under a blanket by the fireplace with a hot cup of tea? Or are you lounging on a beach with the sun beating down and a warm breeze blowing through your hair? No matter where your ideal spot to read is, I'd wager a guess that you imagine yourself reading silently. Reading hasn't always looked this way throughout history. We recognize now that reading can happen in 3 different ways. Oral, when we hear ourselves read. Oral, when we listen to others read. And silent, when we read with our eyes. The earliest records of reading tell us that reading was an act, an event that was performed for a community, and not often a private endeavor. In his book, Space Between Words, Paul Sanger explains some of the fundamental differences between modern and ancient reading. Modern reading is a silent, solitary, rapid activity. Ancient reading was usually oral, either aloud and in groups, or individually in a muffled voice. Alberto Manuel explains that in ancient societies, normal reading was performed out loud. Even though instances of silent reading can be traced to earlier dates, not until the 10th century does this manner of reading become usual in the West. So that leaves us with a question. How did we get from there to here? How did reading evolve throughout history? Sanger explains that in the West, the ability to read silently and rapidly is a result of the historical evolution of word separation. The beginning in the 7th century changed the format of the written page, which had to be read orally and slowly in order to be comprehended. Books or text were initially written in scriptura continua, a continuous line of words strung together without spaces or breaks. This limited access to text and even reading itself. There were a few select individuals who could read, and this group was often restricted to court and clergy. Manuel further explains that whether it was the first Sumerian tablets or the primordial languages in the Bible, the act of reading was meant to be done aloud. There was little differentiation between reading and speaking. They were one and the same. Prior to the 10th century, reading was almost exclusively oral and never silent. Around this time, word spacing began to be put into practice as an aid to reading aloud, but it soon gave rise to 2 new practices: silent copying and silent reading. This is when reading was spun on its head and changed forever. While it seems like a simple development, word spacing changed the face and function of reading. It made reading easier and more accessible. It made books more visual. It made the act of reading more private. It made books cover a vast range of topics. And it was also less intensive. These changes made reading more accessible for more people in the social hierarchy, and as Sanger writes, as a consequence, even readers of modest intellectual capacity could read more swiftly, and they could understand an increasing number of inherently more difficult texts. Between 1500 and 1800, silent reading rose at the expense of oral reading. Over the same period, reading became a more private and less public act. Samuel Pepys was an English naval administrator in the 17th century who kept an incredibly detailed diary from 1660 to 1669. In his journal, Pepys describes oral reading as a service from the speaker to the listener and as a social event. It becomes clear through his journal that a social hierarchy was used to determine who read to whom. It continued to be evident throughout Pepys's journal that his choices of reading material were often very deliberate, either for personal advancement, public statements, or a desire to revere what the world esteemed. Pepys's story is an example of the values and attitudes towards reading in the 17th century. It helps build the bridge between where reading started and where it has ended up today. The ability to read is life-changing. The difference between being literate or illiterate has a monumental impact on the journey our lives will take. Gar Craney and Smith Miller argue that studying and researching the history of reading tells educators a lot about how, when, what, and why we read today. In addition, Jonathan Rose adds that the history of reading is essential to recovering the history of education. All education involves some form of reading, that is, deciphering and extracting information from a text. The Literacy Company notes some of the issues that arise from oral reading are vocalization problems, excessive eye fixations, distortion of the author's intent, and failure to grasp meanings of unfamiliar words. These mostly relate to the speed at which a text is read, the comprehension of the text, and the fluency. On the flip side, the literacy company identifies the benefits of effective silent reading, which is the opportunity to explore a wide variety of texts, reading with purpose, self-efficacy, and steady progress in personal reading practices. What the literacy company is ultimately stating is that while both silent and oral reading have meaningful shares in a literate life, silent reading is more personal, reflective, and effective.